Welcome to Dolby Creator Talks. I'm Ben Givarz. This is a show about how creatives use technology to tell their stories, and my guest today is mix engineer Alex Gamble, who joins from his studio in Toronto to take us inside his stellar and immersive Dolby Atmos mixes for the 2025 FKA Twigs album, Eusexua. Eusexua is the third album by English singer, songwriter, producer, and dancer FKA Twigs, and it is truly a sonic delight, drawing on a variety of musical styles, including electronic, R&B, trip-hop, choral music, industrial, and even avant-garde, and it has received massive praise across the music world, including universal acclaim from Metacritic based on 24 critic scores and a 4-star review from Rolling Stone. The album features a diverse range of producers, including FKA Twigs herself, alongside producers Corliss, Earth Eater, Sasha, and Bapari, to name a few, with stereo mixing by Manny Marroquin and John Castelli, and mastering by the great Dale Becker. So Alex did an amazing job retaining the creative intent of those producers and engineers while taking the album to the next level in Dolby Atmos. He shares his theory and technique for Atmos, including how he lays out his sessions, how he uses dynamic objects, and his use of automation with the Dolby Atmos Music Panner, which allows him for precise time-based panning. And he shares a bit about his approach to using plugins, his binaural settings and QC process, along with his beginnings in the industry, coming up as a mixer, and how he built out his Dolby Atmos room in Toronto. It's a great discussion exploring a boundary-pushing album that really shines in stereo, but is especially interesting in immersive Dolby Atmos. Here's Alex Gamble on FKA Twigs, Eusexua. So happy to welcome from beautiful Toronto, Ontario, mix engineer Alex Gamble to Dolby Creator Talks. Hello, Alex. Congrats on the mixes, and thank you for doing this.
Hey, thanks for having me, Ben.
Absolutely. So excited to get into the Dolby Atmos mixes you've done for the newest FKA Twigs album, Eusexua, which must have been a lot of fun to mix by the sounds of it, by the way. But I wanted to first get into a little bit of your background as a mixer. And I know you've mixed a variety of artists and genres, a lot of it kind of being in the indie realm. But can you share a little bit about your beginnings kind of in studios and in the industry and your work in the indie world?
I've been working professionally in audio in different capacities for a little over a decade now. I'm in a studio now called Union Sound Company. I'm in their B room, which is like a mix room. I've been mixing in here for about the last 5 months or so, but my history with this building actually goes back to the very beginning of my career. I first got started in this industry as an intern at this very studio. And in fact, the studio was still being built when I started interning here. So I actually helped put up the walls and build all the isolation and wire things up. And in this room in particular, after we finished their main tracking room, which is just down the hall, amazing room with like lots of ISO boosts, vintage Neve console, great mics, everything. They started running sessions in there first. And then this room was still just like a pile of drywall. And they said, well, you seem to get the hang of building studios. Here's the plans. Can you put it together? And so I actually built this studio 10 years ago and find myself back in here mixing it as of recently. But yeah, like I started 10 years ago and started as an intern, moved my way up to assistant, got to be on all sorts of great recordings, became their staff engineer for a little bit, got to work with some really, really cool bands from Toronto and all over Canada, and even some from elsewhere, people like Fucked Up, who I've been working with for the last 10 years or so in various capacities. Always has been in the studio, Broken Social Scene, Bruce Coburn, all sorts of amazing acts. Did that for about 5 years and then started freelancing a bit. And over that period of time, just started getting hired to mix more and really loved the work. And nowadays I find myself doing that full time. And in particular, I've gotten into Dolby Atmos in the last, I'd say 4 years or so, and really built out a niche with doing that sort of work. I find it a lot of fun. Tried to get on it as early as I could, like as soon as Apple Music went online with it, checked it out and was like, yep, this is for me. Let's try this out. Worst case scenario, I'll have a lot of speakers I got to sell afterwards, but luckily they're all still here with me. And it's opened up a lot of doors for me, definitely. And so, lately I've gotten to mix stuff, like you mentioned, the FKA Twigs project. I've done some stuff for Gucci Mane, Fly on a Bus, Envy of None, some really, really awesome music. I've just been really lucky to get those opportunities.
Well, good things happen to good people. And it's cool that you've been on a path that started in one place and kind of brought you back there. But there were some winding roads along the way, right? I mean, you mentioned
sure.
you were an early adopter of Dolby Atmos in Toronto. And I think one of the rooms you were in early on was called Raven Tape, right? Which
That's
is
right.
in Toronto. And
Yep.
from the looks of it, that looked like it was way more than just like a mix room, like really a creative space for kind of like writing and recording and production, which is what the space you're in now also looks like as well. But share a little bit about your intro to Atmos and kind of how the system came to be at Raven Tape.
I mean, I knew about Dolby Atmos beforehand. A close friend of mine is Justin Gray, who's become a, kind of a reference point on Dolby Atmos, even globally. Like, he's got a great YouTube channel, amazing musician as well, great engineer, great mixing and mastering engineer. I knew he was getting into it. I didn't know a lot about it, except that I knew he was buying a lot of speakers during COVID. But then all of a sudden Apple Music went online with it, and I was like, oh, I got to check this out a little bit more. Threw on my AirPods and put on a mix, and was just really blown away. I mean, I got to say, like, my understanding of it originally was that it was just a speaker-based format, like something that's done in cinemas or something that's done in speaker rooms, and largely, it's an amazing way to enjoy it. It wasn't until Apple Music brought it on that I realized, oh, it's more than just that. It's for headphones, it's for sound bars, it could be for cars and everything. So I checked it out. I loved it. At that time, that was, I guess, 2021. I was working on finishing up a record at that time with an artist named Selena Martin. And we were just about to go into the mixing phase. And this was all being done like over COVID. So sessions were being done on Zoom, audio movers, that sort of thing. She wasn't in the same location as me. And even if she was, we probably couldn't even get in the studio together. So we're doing that very classic COVID thing. And it was maybe like a day or two after I heard those first mixes on Apple Music, I said to Selena, I was like, I just discovered this cool new thing called Atmos. I just got the software. Do you want to like play around with it and see if we can get it running? And so we were just doing an audio movers session again. So I just sent the binaural feed into my ears and over audio movers to her, and just like took a sound. And I was just like, all right, let's see if it works. Let's pan this, bongo drum over our heads, and did it. And we both just looked at each other like, this is amazing. And, we started experimenting more and more and more, and it just snowballed from there. And I mean, she expressed to me that like she wished this was something that she'd had her whole career, because her mixes are very dense at times, and just the ability to create that space and put things in different places and create this whole new dimension to the music, I think was really appealing to her and really appealing to me as the person trying to realize the vision that she had for the music. So it all kind of started from there. I just dove right into it after that. We did that whole record in headphones, and then we rented a studio in Toronto that had Atmos to finish it up on speakers. And I was just basically hooked after that. I was just like, sign me up. So I outfitted Raven Tape with the speaker setup, and things have just kept going from there.
And now you've built out your room at Union Sound Company, which is also a creative space from the looks of it. And I believe it was designed by Signal Acoustics, and I can kind of see you've got some PMCs there. You've got some Genelecs in the back. How did you approach this build, and kind of what were you looking to achieve with the room?
For me, like over the last few years, mixing has really been my bread and butter. That's where I'm getting hired the most. And so I really wanted to dial this room in specifically for mixing. I do like a little bit of recording in here, and I do a little bit of production, but I'd say 95% of what gets done in here is mixing. And so I really just wanted to like prioritize the monitoring environment in here. I've kind of gone through different iterations in terms of how I want to set a studio up, like for gear and that sort of thing. I've kind of realized over time that all the outboard gear that I had access to at other studios, I was just never using. Like over time, I was just working in the box because that's where I felt comfortable. That's where I felt fastest. That's where I felt most creative. And so I made a conscious effort this time around just to say, no, this is going to be about building the best monitoring environment possible. I'm going to sell some outboard off and just get the best monitors I can possibly put in here and really focus on workflow, aesthetics, just having it be like a comfortable place to be in all day long and just like great speakers to listen to. So I chose PMC 6.2s. Those are my main stereo pair. I do a lot of work still in stereo, mixing and mastering. So I'll be using those quite a bit for that. And then for the Atmos system, it's all Genelec 8330s. It's a 914 configuration. And the subwoofer is a 7360, I believe. They're all running the Genelec GLM system, which I absolutely love. I think they've built such a great system that really understands their speakers' capabilities and where they like to operate. And I think it's just made the system sound so cohesive and so awesome. It's definitely the best monitoring environment I've been in. I'm feeling very lucky to be able to do the work in here. The only other gear is, well, the interface, which is a DAD AX Center. I'm using that just because I love the Digital Audio Denmark workflow. I set up all my monitoring through that. So I've got like a bunch of different sources that I can send out of Pro Tools or send out of the Dolby Atmos render that I could toggle between. The DAD handles all of that. I send to an external Dolby Atmos render over the Thunderbolt card. And I do that versus Dolby Audio Bridge or versus the internal render just because I love the additional routing flexibility I can get. So I'm not just sending the 128 channels and LTC. I'm also got like my stereo reference master going at a separate output. And I've got all, different re-renders going to different sources and things like that. So a DAD interface really helps manage that in such a clean way. It's also got great features for dialing in a subwoofer. It's got great features for calibrating your speakers. But like I said, I chose the GLM route for the Genelecs. But I do use some of the SPQ, EQ on the PMCs. And it was just like a nice, clean solution to everything. The the sort of running joke is that like there's one analog cable in this whole studio and it's the one to this microphone right now. And the DAD allows me to do that because all these Genelecs, they have AES inputs. The PMCs have AES inputs. And I've got all sorts of options for digital outputs on the DAD. So literally everything's ones and zeros till it touches the speakers, which just gives me the confidence that the signal is just so clean and it's not going through anything that might crap out or have signal losses or anything like that. It's just ones and zeros right till it touches the speakers. No excuses for me. Basically, it's just the monitoring environment I've always wanted.
That's a great system, and Genelecs just sound gorgeous. I think
they're awesome. They're great speakers to listen to and work on.
And it sounds like with your setup, harnessing DAD and the DAD stuff, that it gives you a lot of flexibility in all of the things that you want to achieve. Now, when it comes to like actually mixing in Dolby Atmos, I know each project, of course, is different, but like share a little bit about like your general kind of theoretical approach to mixing in Atmos. I know you've been doing it for a number of years, and you've probably found things that are best practices that you employ. But like, what are you hoping to achieve? Like when you get into a project, like understanding everything is a little bit different, but kind of your theoretical approach when it comes to mixing this way.
It can be a challenge sometimes. I'd say like 95% of the work that I do in Dolby Atmos, and I know a lot of engineers have this experience too, like most of it is where the type of workflow where stereo is done first. So the stereo production is done, a stereo mix is done, a stereo master is done. And, I said that in about 5 seconds, but you and I both know that sometimes a record can take years and years of people's lives. It can go through many iterations. And, there's a lot of emotion that goes behind it. And I know that when I get that stereo master, that it's telling me a lot more than just, here's what the song sounds like. There's a whole backstory of how it came to be that way and what it means to the artist that, I really take pride in handling with kid gloves. So when I first get a mix to do, I'm usually given the stereo master and I'm given some stems, or I'm given maybe a Pro Tools session or something like that, some way that I can basically start from where they left off. And the first thing I'm doing is I'm really spending time with that master. I want to listen to the song a few times. I really want to understand how it makes me feel, and really get in touch with my first impressions of it. While I'm doing that, I'm going through the stems, understanding what I was sent, what's there, what I can work with, and the sort of manipulations that I might make to the stuff. But really understanding that stereo master is key. That's the first bit of preparation that I'm going to do. Because I don't want to do stuff in this format that's just doing it to do it. I want to take cues from the production that tell me, okay, this might work. An example would be, in like electronic music, there's a very common thing that, before a big transition, there's like a pitched element or like some white noise that's filtering up and building tension and then releasing. They call it a riser, right? And it, in the stereo mix, it's going through two speakers. Well, why not make the riser rise? Like, why do we do that filtering? Why did we do that volume automation? It's to sort of get this feeling of elevation and this feeling of building tension and things like that. So oftentimes when I do those listens, I'm picking out elements like that where I'm thinking like, okay, they did all these like crazy tricks in stereo to get to feel that way, and they did it really, really well. But why not just take those things that are very imaginary and make them real? Because a lot of these stereo productions are meant to like trigger your imagination. Why not take those things that were imaginary in two speakers and make them real in 3 dimensions? So I'm trying to pick out things in the production that I can do that with. And also just like listening to the stems versus listening to the master, trying to understand if I've got everything I need to actually do the work or if there's some kind of missing ingredient. A lot of the times I'll load the stems up, I'll A/B it against the master, and I'll say, yep, sounds about right. Sometimes I'll do it and the stems will be a lot more dynamic. Then it becomes a decision. Okay, do I like these dynamics and can I use them in the Atmos mix? Or were those like reduced dynamics a part of the aesthetic that they were going for? And so I'm asking myself those questions as well, and doing what I need to do to get the stems into a shape where I can just start being creative with them. And I do all that work up front. I mostly use objects, and so I try to prepare the stems in a way where I can just break things out into objects, but not break whatever glue and relative levels and dynamics that they had going on in the stereo. Because that's the challenge of using objects, is that you don't have that mix bus anymore. So I actually try to tap into some of the things that I was taught in audio school at Nimbus in Vancouver, where they taught you to like, don't just save all your decisions for the end, commit up front. So I'm actually doing a process of committing some processing on the stems at the start if it needs it. So for example, if there was like a heavy-handed master and it's really important for the aesthetic of the music, I'll go and I'll try to listen to what was being done and do my version of that. Maybe save like a bit of headroom because I'm mixing at -18. So, I want to use that extra headroom if I can. But trying to make that call early on of like, what do I need to do to these stems so that things don't fall apart when I start breaking it out into objects and putting it in different places in the room. So that work's all being done up front, and I usually just make a plug-in chain. I've got a little SoundFlow script that busts it onto every stem. Sometimes it takes a little bit of side chaining work to get things to go right, but once I get it, I just commit that. I keep the old versions in case I need to go backwards, but I just commit it on every stem, which seems like a crazy thing to say. It's kind of like mastering first, which is a little bit backwards, but the master's really already been done for all intents and purposes. And when I hear that master, that I'm hearing an artist telling me, I like this. So I want to make sure that I can timbrally and dynamically give them what they already like, and then just build on top of that. So that's my approach to doing it. And then it's just a lot of following instincts and going from there, because all that sort of guesswork and stuff in the back of my mind is out of the way at that point. And then I can just start having fun with panning things.
When you're thinking about and listening to this, I think you answered a lot of it, but I wanted to ask, like, was what you were delivered, did it set the stage for what you wanted to achieve in Atmos, or did you have to do some of that like mastering chain ahead of time on this one specifically, or did you just go right into it thinking about, how to mix it?
Yeah, for the most part, the stems came in really, really clean. I mean, John and Manny are just absolutely world class, and so it's no surprise that the stems came in great. It was they represented the stereos really well. It was sort of just enough commitment of groups and just enough flexibility that I could really build out a big soundstage. So there wasn't a crazy amount of stuff that I had to do. Also, Dale's masters on this, like really, they preserved a lot of dynamics in it. So I wasn't in a situation where I felt like I needed to really smash things to get what they were after. Everybody did like such a great job ahead of me, and I was just handed these amazing files, and it's almost like cheating. I mean, I got to give credit where credit's due. And we're talking about the sound of this record. Everybody that touched it before me did just such an amazing job and set me up so well for success for the Atmos mix. So there wasn't a ton of that. There was like a few things where, maybe the master was like a little bit brighter timbrely or things like that. Maybe there was like a little bit of stereo widening done on the master and things like that. But all very subtle stuff. And, at that stage where I'm like assessing the stems versus the master, I'm not trying to go overboard to do like an exact match, because things are going to change once I start panning things around. Timbre and transients and things like that, they change depending on where you choose to pan things in an Atmos environment. But yeah, things came in sounding so great. And, I mean, the productions were great, very intimate, very cerebral, and really big scene changes in a lot of these songs. The title track, like, it goes from like almost like song to song, like within songs. And there's a lot of different tracks that do it, and a lot of like glitchy, cool elements too. Like that's one of the things that I latched onto on my first listen as well. Like I'm hearing a lot of glitching on songs like Drums of Death and thinking like, okay, this is stuff that'll really be interesting to pull into 3 dimensions and see if I can really build upon this production.
Absolutely. And I wanted to ask you about a few of those specifically. But one thing that I noticed, and you mentioned it before, that there seems to be like a theme of like movement, a sense of movement throughout the record, like within each song, within like even, verses of a song, a lot of dynamic movement and a lot of time-based movement that you were able to work with. And I know you do a lot of kind of frame by frame automation using the music panner that probably lent itself really well to a lot of those creative decisions. Like in the title track that you're mentioning, it sort of starts with that like swirling synth line around you, where it kind of like encompasses you, and sounds like the vocal is it sounds like you're using phantom center in some places, but then in some places it sounds like the vocal is actually like in the center, and there's a sense of reverb in the heights, and there's that kind of like rattling sound that goes around. So there's just from the start a lot of movement in the tracks, and it sounds like you were really intentional about how you did that.
Definitely the productions had a lot of movement in them, and I was trying to acknowledge that with some of the Atmos effects that were going on. Well, one of the first things that happens in that track is it's just like a bare kick that's side chaining some reverb. And what I try to do with it, and what I try to do a lot of times in these moments where there's like a kick side chaining something else, I really love the effect of not just like it being a side chain dynamically, which is, all you can really do in stereo, but almost like having the side chain kind of move like back to front a little bit in a subtle way. So it's almost like a call and response of like sort of the kick happens like up front, and then the reverb was sort of side chaining and pushing energy towards the front, and it's kind of pushing you almost towards the first vocal line, which is very dry and very intimate. And so yeah, trying to use movement to really acknowledge what was going on in the production was a big one. Music panner was a big one that I would use a lot. It's a really useful tool. It's one of the reasons why I stay on the external renderer, because that music panner, I just can't live without it. You can make some really cool motions that are sequenced to the music. Yeah, it can really, you can get some really cool sound designy things that are happening with it. And because it's all tempo synced, it's all going to stick with the music. I do a lot of manual panning too. So at the studio, I've got 3 Avid S1s. One of the things I love about the Avid S1s behind me is that you can put all the panning parameters of the 3-dimensional panner flipped onto the faders. So a lot of the times when I'm doing Atmos work, the faders actually aren't for volume, they're for panning. And I've just gotten like really used to, where my height fader is and where my front to back fader is and things like that. And just really tried to dig deep into like some of the more advanced automation features within Pro Tools, which is the DAW I use for all this. Things like automation preview mode, things like latch, prime, and stop, which is something I just found out about like a year ago. Little like it's this feature where like you don't actually have to be in playback. You can just make a selection and change your panning location and then just commit it to that frame or that segment of audio. And so some of those like little glitchy moments in that song and some others, I was like, okay, this glitch goes here, this glitch goes there. And just, and it also being cognizant to not make it gimmicky too. There, like those moments went through a lot of different iterations. I usually start out going maybe a little bit overboard and then sort of reining myself in. I never want this to be about making a new production. Like the production is made and I loved the production. So I'm not trying to change what the production is on any of these things. Again, it's realizing things that are imaginary in sometimes a more real way, in a tangible way, which you can do in 3 dimensions in a really cool way. Another thing that I use for dynamic panning is Sound Particles Brightness Panner and Energy Panner. I was going through the sessions the other day and I realized I was actually using that quite a bit on this record. Like on Drums of Death, there's this really big explosion sound that happens once in a while. And I was using, I believe it was Energy Panner on that to create this effect where the explosion sort of starts at the front and then kind of chaotically and weirdly and unexpectedly goes to the back. Again, like it was a pretty intense sound and I thought, okay, let's do something that acknowledges what the sound is. And that seemed like a good move.
I think that was a great decision. And in fact, I feel like that's a highlight of the record and particularly in Atmos. And of course, like the production by Corliss, who's, featured prominently on the song is just amazing. But I think it really maximizes what's possible, with mixing in Atmos and you really achieved it. So much movement, really precise, like very precise placement with everything like the glitches and the stabs and the builds and the vocals. And actually when I play it for people in a room, they're like, this is what Atmos was made for. It's just
God, that's awesome to hear that.
So much going on in there. And that must have been so much fun to mix. And like you just explained it.
It's a funny thing. Like the early feedback from Corliss was to keep the enhancements in Atmos fairly subtle. I feel like I did that, but still filled the room in a satisfying way. Like I never want it to be about like distracting you from the music because the music's like her music's awesome. I love it. I feel so lucky to have had a chance to get to work on it. So I really want it to be about enhancing the music and bringing your focus on the music. And at moments the room is really filled up, like with these Atmos mixes. But I really try to handle it with kid gloves and do it in a way where you don't notice it being Atmosy, if that is a word. Maybe I just invented a word.
I think I've heard it bandied about here and there.
Yeah. So the room opens up at times, but with this and with everything, I still really want it to be about the music and taking cues from the production and sort of following what my instinct is, using that as a guide. And
I think you did. I think you achieved that. You honored the creative intent of the original and gave, a new experience through the tool set here. One song I wanted to ask you about, Room of Fools, with the synth kind of intro where it's sort of swirling around you.
Mm-hmm.
How did you write the automation for that? Was that using that latch method in Pro Tools?
Those first like glitchy kind of sounds in the intro before the beat kicks in. Yeah, that was all manual automation actually. Yeah, it's like a combination of some front to back stuff and some height stuff. Rarely doing left to right stuff when I'm doing stuff that's already been done in stereo. I just kind of take it as an unwritten rule that if they've baked in some stereo imaging to just keep it. So it's usually stuff in the height domain and the front to back domain, but that stuff was was all manual, and it was just sort of like listening to it. I had, again, like the panning parameters flipped onto my S1, just kind of listening to it, doing like a few manual rides here and there, and away we went.
Very cool. And I think, like every song on the record is incredible, and you've done a wonderful job mixing it. But skipping to the end, the track Wonderlust, which a lot of layering of vocals again. I mean, how many vocal layers were you delivered? Like how many vocal stems did you get in general for these tracks? There must have been a lot of them.
There was a lot. And yeah, credit to John and Manny for giving me all that flexibility. But also, yeah, I was opening up the mixes the other day, and I could see like in some cases all 128 objects were completely populated. And like I said earlier, I'm all about using objects as opposed to beds. And so yeah, there was a lot. I can't remember exactly how many in that song, but yeah, they gave me a lot of flexibility, so I could really be precise and really be intentional with where each one was hitting. And in some cases, it was just like different sort of vocals playing different roles on different tracks. So I would just choose a static positioning for that track, and it would work. But sometimes, again, like manual automation, like maybe when the chorus hits, I want to move something to a certain place and fill the room up. And when the verse hits, have the room not be so full.
Well, you mentioned the Sound Particles Energy Panner. What other plugins do you find useful when mixing in Atmos?
That's a big one. I use Pentio from Perfect Surround a decent amount. I'll use that on things like lead vocal and on drums. And what I'm trying to do with it is just fill up the rest of the sound stage in a way that's decorrelated and not going to feel phasey. Because typically speaking, I'm putting vocals and drums up front, like on the front wall. And for the exact reason of why I'm facing you during this conversation. Like it's just human nature when somebody is speaking to us and delivering us a message that we face them. And so, yeah, 99% of the time, the lead vocal is coming at me from the front. The drums are coming at me from the front. I've just found I can get the most power and energy out of them. And I know as a stereo mixer, how much effort you put into getting that power and getting that energy into your drum sound. And I wouldn't dream of changing that in a million years. And it just sounds the best usually coming up front. Not every single piece of a drum, like maybe there's some auxiliary percussion, things like that can go in other places, but usually the main kick and snare, like the stuff that's keeping the main beat, goes up front. And so Pentio comes into play. I can populate the rest of the speakers with a bit of kick and snare and with a bit of vocal, where it still feels positioned up front, but if I lean my head back or walk to the back of the room, I don't completely lose it. So it's a really useful tool for doing that. I'll use a lot of transient shapers. I really like the neutron transient shaper. I alluded to it earlier. Sometimes when you change position on things, the transient energy changes a lot. Like for example, something with a lot of transients coming out of the side speakers can really sound way more transient. Sometimes it's cool, but other times it's like, okay, whoa, chill out. So I'll get the transient shaper and maybe tame some of that stuff up. Because yeah, you can't, it's not just panning that you do in this. Like you're creating a spatial presentation, but then you also need to stop and assess, okay, what changed when I changed positions here? And do I like it or do I need to address it? So that's one that commonly comes up. I do actually some mid-side processing. So usually when I get stems or stereo stems with some imaging baked in. And so I think it was actually on the Twigs record that I started doing this, where like a vocal is a good example. A vocal's largely a mono instrument, but sometimes there's stereo processing on it. Maybe there's something like a micro shift or a stereo delay or something like that that's baked into the stem. And one of the challenges is you got that center speaker there, and it tends to sound good for vocals. I mean, when you're mixing film and television, literally that's what the speaker's for. And so I want to use a bit of that. But if you've got stereo information on your stem and you put it all into a mono speaker, you lose that information. So what I do is I send the vocal through a bus in Pro Tools. I duplicate the bus, and on one version, I've got wave center on it, and I'll have the mid content to that stem soloed. And then I've got another aux where the side content to that stem is soloed. So when they're both playing together through two speakers, it just sounds like the stem. But what it allows me to do is I can break the mid content into a set of objects and the side content into a set of objects. So what I'll do is I'll take that mid duplicate and I'll fold that ever so slightly into the center speaker, but the side content stays fully out to the sides. So I actually don't lose any of the imaging that was built into the stereo mix, but I can populate that center speaker. And sometimes I'll even get creative, and maybe that side content sounds good coming from the wide speakers or the side speakers or somewhere above me. So I'm doing a lot of that too. Like wave centers ended up in my template quite a bit for a bit of mid-side processing, because yeah, sometimes it can be a cool effect.
For sure. And I've heard of people using Pentio kind of that way too, like starting with it in the sides and sort of folding decorrelation into the center channel from that plugin as well. So
yeah, it can be a really effective tool for doing that as well.
Gives you a lot of flexibility. Let's talk a little bit about like your binaural workflow. And I know you have an object template that you use for your binaural settings. How did you build that? And sort of what's your approach to kind of those finishing touches for the headphone experience?
Definitely one of the reasons I use primarily objects is so that I can optimize that headphone experience. Definitely using a bed can be handy for bus processing. But when you're using a bed, you just have one set of binaural settings for that whole bed. And sometimes you want something different for a certain sound. And so using objects, one of the benefits is that I can have a binaural setting for every single sound. So yeah, I've been using the same binaural settings layout for about a year now. And basically I just make sure I have enough of all the settings that I like. So I've got my main bed has like kind of different settings for different zones. The front wall is usually off. And then it's kind of like a dynamic, maybe like near for the sides. I think it might be mid for the rears. I can't remember exactly what it is for the heights, but yeah, different settings for different parts of the bed. And then objects 11 through 60 are near. That tends to be my favorite setting for most things that I want to binauralize. Then I've got another 20 or so objects for mid, another 20 or so objects for far, and then another 20 or so for off. And yeah, I've just kind of developed it over time, knowing what my mixing habits are and what my preferences for the settings are. And there's just, enough of them available so that I'm not going to run out of a setting I like. Although in some of these twigs mixes, it was pretty challenging where I was using every single object. So, I had to be very precise and deliberate. And I think I might have broken my template a couple times and changed a setting here and there. But I like working that way because over a few years of experience, I've just kind of gotten to know what's going to sound good on a certain type of instrument or a certain type of sound. Like I'll just solo it, even like soloing it in speakers. I can just know like, oh yeah, I'm going to want that to be near. Or like I hear a lead vocal and I'll be like, well, I think I want that one to be off because it's very close sounding and I don't want any distance effects on it. And so as I'm building my mix, I'm making these assignments, keeping the binaural mix in the back of my mind. And it's saved me a lot of time because now like I'll do my speaker mix first and I'll make those assignments based on my intuition of what I think I want the binaural settings to be. And then I'll just pop the headphones on and most of the time it's like, yep, that's basically what I wanted. Might change a setting here and there. But for the most part, I'm getting predictable results doing it that way.
Nice. And it's a great use case for using dynamic objects to be able to have that much control over the filters that are applied to them. And, a lot of times people get really stuck into like mixing with object beds, for example, and that's great, but it can cause some, it can create some challenges when it comes to how the HTRF filters are applied specifically because they're all baked into the bed. And, I think you just end up with so much more control and a more control over that headphone experience that, let's be frank, a lot of people are listening that way. And so
for sure,
employ those tools. And
I also got to say, I feel like in terms of like pan laws and like the math that's done to place a sound, I prefer the sound of objects quite a bit. And I've done the work of like being like, okay, when I pan this here, what happens to the sound when I pan that there? And I just feel like the pan laws that you've built into the Dolby ecosystem are doing better math than the pan laws. This is no shade on Pro Tools, but I just like I find myself always rebalancing things when I'm mixing into an object bed. Whereas if I'm just mixing in discrete objects, I can just sort of move it to the place I want, and it's still I'm retaining the balance that I had. So it's less work for me in that sense, because I know it's just translating my intention better without me having to change volumes and things like that. And I find, having one object with one setting seems to be more friendly for translation versus like something toggling like 7 different objects with 7 different settings, and having to create sort of like a phantom location from that. But again, it causes a lot of work for me up front to, like, if I do get a master that I can tell has had a lot of compression on it, and there's a lot of glue with compression and it's squashed the dynamics, and maybe it's not in the stems, I got to do a bunch of work up front to get it there, because like I don't really have a mix bus when I'm using objects.
You also mentioned that, the album was mastered by the great Dale Becker. Huge shout out to Dale. But you do use the album assembler, I'm sure, to like A/B back and forth between your stereo or the stereo versions and the stereo mix. Can you share a little bit about your workflow with that and kind of how you prepare to deliver this, and what sort of the back and forth process was with the creative team on the record to get to the place of delivery?
Sure. Yeah. I do use the album assembler. I've had a few situations where I actually have printed my masters out of there, but most of the time when I'm doing an LP, I'll use the album assembler as just like a final check to bring all the songs in and just hear everything front to back. Because in Pro Tools, you're just hearing like one song at a time. And I'm usually mixing the individual songs to hit that -18 target, which is great for singles. I'll usually just deliver it at -18 with some true peak headroom. But with an album, -18 might not be the best level for every single song. So that gives me an opportunity to assess what that final level is going to be for each song. And it gives me one last chance to hear how the album flows as a whole. Maybe like at that point I'm hearing things like, oh, actually this song's feeling dark compared to everything else, and I didn't notice it when I was doing the mix. So I'll do that, and I'll make a few notes, and then I'll actually take it back to the Pro Tools session and make the changes there. Just because when revisions come and things change down the road, I find it's a lot easier to just bounce it once as opposed to bouncing it out of Pro Tools and then bringing it into the assembler again and bouncing it again. So I'll just go into album assembler. I'll make my notes of like how much things need to gain up or gain down. Maybe some notes on EQ. Maybe I'm noticing something about a transition that I didn't notice when I was working on that song individually, like something needed to fade a little quicker, a little slower, something like that. And then make my notes and go back to Pro Tools. As far as other things for finalizing, I've got a checklist that's way too big because unlike in the stereo world where there's usually a mastering engineer kind of catching things at the very, very end, that's kind of a rarity in this world. When I can, I'm usually hiring Justin Gray to do all my Atmos mastering. He does an awesome job, but it's not always the case. In a lot of cases, I'm the last line of defense for Dolby Atmos. And so I just want to make sure that whatever I deliver over to the artist or the label or whoever's going to be taking the files is just absolutely spotless. So yeah, the list has grown. All sorts of different QC things that I check. Things like, one simple check that I do is, because I'm using the external render, it allows me to do this, is I'll just open up the ADM in the external render. And there's a little button on the external render where you can toggle between input and you can toggle between master. Just a simple little thing like making sure that all the objects that are there in the master are active when you go to input. And if there's any differences, figuring out why. I've caught things that way before. So there's a million little checks that I'm doing like that before I deliver things. And it's a big part of the job. Like I'm the last line of defense in these. So I want to make sure that, things are spotless. Tomorrow, there's a project being released that I'm really, really excited about. It's this band called Envy of None. It's Alex Lifeson from Rush, Andy Curran of Coney Hatch, great producer and engineer and an instrumentalist, Alfio Annabellini, and this really, really amazing vocalist, Maya Wynn. This project is awesome. And they really, really cared about the Atmos experience to the extent where they've actually released it on Blu-ray. So I know it's going to be going to an audience that really values the speaker experience. So that's what I'm really, really excited about. It's getting released tomorrow. So shout out to them and congrats on the release to them. Another one I've mentioned Justin a couple times. He's actually in the finalizing phase of a record of his music that he's making. And last year I spent the better part of a month in a studio with him, just going absolutely overboard on immersive miking techniques with him. We're doing everything from like microphone arrays, and just all sorts of crazy stuff. We took the control room of this studio and actually built like an immersive speaker array so that we could monitor it in immersive while we were making it. So this, I mentioned earlier that most of the time stereo is being done first. This is one where immersive was prioritized. It was part of the production. Like the intention of the production was spatializing things. So that's getting wrapped up soon. And he's started releasing some YouTube content on the making of. If anyone who's interested in immersive recording should check it out. It was a really fun one to work on. Justin nailed the mixes, and I'm really excited about it.
I've been following his journey over the past couple of years as he's been putting this project together and documenting a lot of it. We've done some things out in the world to help celebrate that. I'm glad to see that it's coming to fruition finally and going to be released. And we'll make sure that we link to it down there in our show notes as well. Thank you for sharing all of that. I wanted to just wrap by, asking you and saying first that, a lot of the work that we do at the Dolby Creator Lab, which is the team that I'm on at Dolby, is to, educate and empower, frankly, the next generation of creatives to use Dolby's technologies. And on the music side, of course, that's Dolby Atmos. And we create and have a lot of resources for technically how to do that. But I say a lot of the time that we create the technology, but it's people like yourself that really bring the art to that tech and bring it to life. So on that tip, I wanted to ask you, for young mixers specifically, or people that are even established mixers that are looking to get into mixing Dolby Atmos, what's sort of your advice to them, and how would you recommend that they get into the world of mixing Dolby Atmos, and how would you get them on their way?
Like I said, I started in headphones. So one of the great things about this format is the scalability. You can put on a set of headphones and you can start mixing. So the tools are there. Like if you have Pro Tools, there's a Dolby Atmos render built right in. Play around with it, see what it does, and mess around a little bit. Just experiment, see what works for you. And then, if you're really serious about it, definitely getting a speaker setup is key. But just because you got the tools and you got the gear doesn't mean it's all there yet. A lot of these techniques took a lot of time and a lot of experimenting, and it's still I'm changing the way I approach things all the time. And so this, not just for Dolby Atmos, for everything, really, really get to know your tools, experiment a lot, spend time that you're not building, just playing around and seeing what the tools do and seeing what your tastes are, seeing what you like, and just practicing it, getting fast with the tools, because the more you know the tools, the faster you are with them, that's fewer barriers between you and your creative goals. And then you can just go, and then the technology completely gets out of the way, and then it's all just creativity. There's a big learning curve with this stuff, so it's a lot of learning to do. Really sit down and really spend the time with it, and once the light bulbs start going on with Dolby Atmos, though, man, it's a lot of fun, and not just for me as the engineer. The artists love it too. I never used to have experiences where people would get emotional listening to their mixes, and then all of a sudden I got into Dolby Atmos, and people just hear it a different way, and it just strikes them in a different way. It's the ceiling is very high with this technology, and so spend time with it, really get to know it, and then when those opportunities come up to be creative with it, you'll be ready.
Thank you for sharing that. That's great advice. And I can tell you're having fun doing it. So congratulations on everything you've done and you've achieved, and you will continue to as well. Alex Gamble, thanks for doing this.
Thank you, Ben.
Massive thanks to my guest, Alex Gamble, for sharing his story and technique used on his mixes for the FKA Twigs album, Eusexua in Dolby Atmos, which you can hear on enabled streaming music services now. For more conversations with mix and mastering engineers and producers working in Dolby Atmos, check out Dolby Creator Talks on all the major podcast platforms, including the video version on YouTube. There are links in our show notes, or you can simply search for Dolby wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're curious to know more about Dolby Creator Lab, go to dolbycreatorlab.com to find out information about all of our programming. There you can subscribe to our mailing list and access the entire library of episodes of this podcast. That's also where you'll find the Dolby Atmos Music Accelerator and Dolby Atmos Music Essentials course, covering all the topics you need to get started creating music in Dolby Atmos. The course is free and available in multiple languages. And for other great Atmos music resources, check out the links in our show notes. Until next time, this is Ben Givarz. The Dolby Creator Talks editor is Michael Coleman. Our executive producers are Amanda Snyder and Jack Ferry, with additional editing by Matt Nixon. And our production coordinator is Karen Marroquin. Thanks for joining.